An old man and his dog featured a dog whose real-life owner was used in the same movie as a body double for the main character. Years after the movie's release, it was revealed that the man was actually one of China's worst serial killers, and his victims became the food for his beloved dog who featured in that award-winning film. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Cheng Peng was born in 1962 as an only child, into a pretty well-to-do family where his dad earned good money working in a political organisation. He had a pretty nice upbringing and by all means was well looked after and had a good childhood. But from early on, his parents and teachers knew something wasn't quite right. He got excluded from school after he was caught bullying some of the other students, and when the teacher went to tell him off, Cheng ended up attacking that teacher. Cheng didn't get good grades through school, and in normal circumstances, this might have made it hard for him to get a good job. But because of his dad's work and the contacts he had, Cheng was able to get a job working at a forestry institute. But while he was there, he did not make the best impression. He was rude to his colleagues and he didn't have any friends there. He wasn't great at the job, and it wasn't long before he stopped doing the work he was supposed to be doing and instead turned to stealing things from the place he was working and then selling them on for money. Cheng's stealing became more of a habit, and over the next couple of years he began stealing more and more. And when he was 17, he was actually found stealing a TV and he was arrested. He was sent to prison for that offence and he was there for 2 years behind bars. Now, his dad could have bailed him out, he had the money, but he said he wanted to teach his son a lesson and so left him in prison for 2 years. After those 2 years in prison, once he was released, Cheng attempted to re-immerse himself in life outside of the prison walls, and his mum and dad wanted to help him do this, and so they told him that they'd found someone who they thought would be suited as a wife. And the thinking was that this woman, who was of good social standing, she had a really good job at a scientific research institute, they thought that maybe this woman would help Cheng to straighten out his life and get back on track. But after the pair got married, Cheng would find himself out and about quite often exploring, and his wife wasn't home a whole lot either because she was often away with work at the research institute. And so Cheng pretty much had free rein to do whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. During his time home alone, Cheng decided that he wanted to have some company, and so he decided to get dogs. And although this started with just 1 or 2, that quickly increased, and it wasn't long before he was housing 10 and then 20 dogs. But he had no idea how to properly train them, and so he would spend his days trying to settle them and not doing a great job. All of this proved a little bit too much for him. He didn't want to stay at home with the dogs all of the time, and so he decided to take himself out, and he took a 3-day trip into the local city of Lanchao. After those 3 days were up, he got the train home, and during his journey on the train ride, he noticed sat across from him in the end of the carriage was a woman. She was a 24-year-old woman, and he found her quite attractive, and so he went over and spoke to her. He found out that the woman's name was Hu, and she was visiting her family. She was on the way back from visiting her family, and she was a student. They had a long conversation for the rest of the train journey, and they ended up getting on pretty well. And so at the end of that train journey, Cheng gave Hu his number and said to call him as soon as she could. She did call him a few days later that week. The two started talking, and it wasn't long before they started dating. Now, obviously, Cheng is married to his wife, but she's away for work, and so he was able to have this affair, and often he was able to host Hu at his house. One morning in 1988, Cheng and Hu were at Cheng's house when he began to become a bit paranoid. He was convinced that his wife was going to come home. There was nothing saying that she definitely would, but he just began to get paranoid, and so he told Hu she had to leave. Now, Hu at this point wasn't too worried. She wasn't the one having the extramarital affair. She just wanted to take her time getting ready, and she would leave the house when she was ready to. And so she got her makeup out, she placed it on the table in the spare room, and she started putting on her lipstick. This infuriated Cheng. He had told Hu that she needed to leave, but she was just taking her time. And so with this, he actually reached to the side of her where there was a pipe wrench. He lifted that pipe wrench up, and without her seeing, he hit her on the head, and he hit her with such force that she actually died almost instantly. And this didn't seem to faze Cheng much at all. In fact, he was so unbothered about it that as soon as he saw who was dead, he was thinking about what his next steps were, and he realised he needed to get rid of the body. And so he dragged Hu's body to the bathtub, placed her inside, and then he got to work. He used a machete to dismember her, and once her body was in small enough pieces, he took those outside into the back garden and he buried them. And then he made a fire and he burnt all of her clothes and belongings, including her makeup that was still at the house. The days passed and then weeks, and nobody came looking for Hu. Cheng might have thought at this point that he was safe. He'd gotten away with murder. Cheng was quite confident, so much so that he moved quickly onto building up a business of his own. He had a specific type of business in mind. Now remember that he'd bought those dogs long before he'd met Hu, and now he was looking to expand and make his hobby of looking after dogs into a business. By now he had actually managed to train them to an extent where he was able to keep control of them, and so he wanted to expand this. Cheng attempted to make this dog breeding business by first sealing off the perimeter around the garden of his house with a wooden fence, and then he bought 30 wolf dogs. However, he quickly came to realise that looking after that many dogs was proving to be very expensive, and he wasn't making the kind of money he'd envisioned. Because of this, he decided he needed to change tact, and that's when he found a different way to make money. Cheng sought the help of his cousin Xiao, and his thinking was that he and Xiao could make a gang, and they would build this gang up to the point where they would be able to be big enough to intimidate people and start robbing people. Cheng and Xiao went to a warehouse that was owned by the Forest Institute that they both worked for. Cheng had heard that the warehouse was full of weapons that had been bought and were being stored there. And so they snuck inside one night and they found a number of guns. They managed to carry 8 of them back to their vehicle, and they took them back to Cheng's house. Cheng then chose 2 of the guns and sawed off the barracks so that they were easier to transport to wherever they'd be robbing next. Cheng and Xiao still spent their days working at the Forest Institute, but by now neither of them were really doing the work that they'd been paid to do, and instead they spent their days seeking out things that they could steal from the Forest Institute. And this included things like furniture and money, and also things of lesser value such as food or plants. Whilst plotting their next robbery, Cheng would spend his evenings out in the back garden and he would do shooting practice. He would try to shoot the chickens and ducks that were in his backyard, and he learnt pretty quickly how to make a good shot, and he would kill 10 to 20 of these chickens and ducks every single week. And as soon as they were dead, he would gather up the corpses and then he would feed them to his dogs. It was at this point that one of Cheng's friends, Yu Dewei, started to speak to him about a problem he was having. His boss owed him some money for some work they had done and he just wasn't paying up. And that's when Cheng said to Dewei that he could help him. He proposed that Dewei joined their gang. Now, he'd already spoken to Xiao about potentially bringing someone else on board. The more people they had, the more manpower they had, the more successful they would be. And ultimately, Dewei agreed. He said that he would join the gang, and they started on a plot to rob his boss. In December of 1990, Cheng and Xiao went to the local train station and they flagged down someone who was driving a minivan. The driver of that minivan, Yang, asked the 2 men where they were going, and they said they needed to get to a casino in the next county and asked if he could drive them there. And he said, yeah, of course he could. What Yang didn't know is that both men were carrying guns and they planned to make this journey his last. They planned to force him to drive to Mr. Lee's business, which is the boss of Dewei, and when they got there, they would shoot him, kill him, dump his body, and then escape in his car. Yang started driving in the direction of the casino, and then Cheng said that he needed to use the bathroom, he needed to go to the toilet, and so could he just pull over here? But Yang said, no, just wait a minute, we're really, really close to some public toilets just a little further on. Cheng used this as a sign. He winked at Xiao, who then took that to mean that he had to shoot Yang in the front seat, and Xiao was right behind him, but he was nervous. He'd never shot a human before, and so in his panic he ended up shooting past and actually into the driver's side door, which then swung open. Yang was facing forward when all of this happened, so he didn't see any of this, and he assumed that the loud bang he heard was one of the tyres having blown out, and so he pulled over and stopped the car and got out to have a look. And as he peered round, he saw that there was a bullet hole in the car, and Cheng saw this happening, and he thought quickly, he acted quickly, and he told Yang that someone was shooting at the car and they needed to go, they needed to get away right now. Assumedly, because of the panic that had taken over, Yang did jump straight back in the car. He started up and the other two men joined him and they sped away down the road. All three men spoke about how terrifying that ordeal had been, and in the midst of this conversation, Cheng suggested that they all go back to his for a cup of tea and to calm down, and Yang did agree to this. Now, we don't know exactly how the next part happened, but somehow Cheng managed to get them back to his house, and he managed to convince Yang to lead and to go into the house first of all. As soon as Yang entered through the front door, Xiao placed his gun facing the back of his head and he shot Yang dead with a single gunshot. They then used that same machete to dismember Yang's body, and then they wrapped pieces of his body in canvas bags, and their plan was to bury them in the back garden, but not all of the pieces of the body would fit in the canvas bags, and so with the pieces that wouldn't fit, Cheng fed those to his dogs. It wasn't until a month later that Cheng and Xiao would murder their next victim. They were worried at this point that with these murders happening, police might get wind of their gang and of what they were doing. And so they did lay low for a little while, but by January of 1991, they had had enough time of lying low and decided to get back on planning their next robbery. This time, the three men, so there's Xiao, Cheng, and their new accomplice, Dewey, they decide to go to a local bus station, Nanmen bus station, and they got a taxi from there. The taxi was driven by a man called Zhang. They told Zhang to drive in the direction of Yinchuan Nursery Farm, and as he started driving, Xiao, who was sat directly behind him, pulled out the gun and aimed it at Zhang's head. They were approaching an area of town that was pretty much abandoned, and so Cheng checked around, made sure that no one was around, and then he asked Zhang to pull over, and he did. But Zhang had pulled over so quickly that it actually jolted Xiao out of position, and he had shot at the windscreen rather than at Zhang, and so the windscreen shattered right in front of Zhang's eyes. This time, the victim would be under no illusion about what was happening. It was very clear that one of these men had tried to shoot him, and so he got out of the car, he scrambled up to his feet, and then he started running as fast as he could away from the direction that the car had just been travelling. Zhang was shouting all this time that these men were trying to kill him, trying to get someone's attention, but they're in quite an abandoned area and no one's about. And during this time, the three men are panicking. They never imagined that someone would potentially escape, and so Cheng and Xiao got their guns out and they started shooting towards Zhang, and they didn't manage to actually get him with a shot, but whilst they were doing this they were running, and they did manage to catch up to him to the point where Zhang had to stop, and they made him kneel down in front of them, and once he was kneeling down he was begging for his life, but they showed him no mercy. Cheng handed his gun to Dewey and told him to shoot the taxi driver, but Dewey refused, saying he couldn't do it, and he handed the gun back to Cheng. Cheng had no problem. He shot Zhang in the head once and he died instantly. Cheng then pulled a knife out and handed it to Dewey and told him he needed to be the one to dismember this taxi driver, but Dewey said he couldn't. He said he would be sick if he even tried, and he started to back away. Cheng and Xiao and Dewey loaded the man's body into the boot of the car and they drove away from the scene. And with that, Cheng told the other men that the plan now was to drive to Dewey's boss's house, to Mr. Lee's house. This was the plan. They were going to go and they were going to sort him out. And Dewey knew at this point that if they arrived at Mr. Lee's address, they would very likely kill him, and Dewey didn't want that to happen. He didn't want to have blood on his hands, and so he made an excuse. He said that it was too early, Mr. Lee wouldn't be there, and so there was no point, and they may as well just turn around and go home. Cheng and Xiao believed him, and so they drove Dewey back to his house, and they dropped Dewey off, and they said that he could go, but he was under strict instruction that he wasn't allowed to tell anyone. And at this point, Cheng and Xiao really believe that he's not going to tell anyone. He's seen what they're capable of, he's seen what they've done, and they certainly are going to do it again, and Dewey knows that. There's no way that he's going to grass on them. Cheng and Xiao then buried Zhang's remains in the back garden, and they covered them with concrete, and the remains that they didn't bury, they fed to Cheng's dogs. It was towards the end of that year that Cheng met a woman called Miss Liu. She was dancing in a nearby ballroom, and he'd seen her across the dance floor. He'd noticed her and he'd quite liked the look of her, so he'd gone over to speak to her. Liu worked at a local cotton factory, and she was in her early 20s. And throughout that night, the two of them would have a conversation, and Liu would end up telling Cheng that her family were looking to find her a rich person to marry. Liu and Cheng continued talking, and eventually they went home together and spent the night together. They met up again the next day, and it's not entirely clear why, but ultimately Cheng agreed to lend Liu some money. Cheng and Liu went out for dinner, and afterwards they went back to his place. They spent the night together, and then the following morning they woke up. Cheng saw Liu get out of bed, put her makeup on the table, and started again doing her lipstick, putting her other makeup on. And that's when he reached to the side of her, pulled his gun out, pointed it at her, and shot her in the head, and immediately she fell down dead. He grabbed Liu's body and he dragged her out of the house and into the garden, and that's where he just left her. And there are 20 to 30 dogs here at this point, and there's this bloody corpse, and so of course they ate the corpse. And when Cheng returned the next day, he saw that actually there was really not much left, and anything there was left, it was small enough that he just gathered it up and put it on the fire and burnt it. It was less than 2 years later that an opportunity would come up for Cheng, and he would take it, and it would change his and many other people's lives forever, although they wouldn't know it until many years later. A movie called An Old Man and His Dog was being made, and the main character needed a well-trained, perfect-looking wolf dog. The director actually settled on Cheng's dog, and Cheng got the opportunity to be on set with the dog, making sure it behaved and took instructions. And he ended up being cast as the body double for the main actor. His day-to-day work included working with Mrs. Yu, who was a crew member who had taken a liking to Cheng. Yu was married, as was Cheng, but that didn't matter to them. The pair started an affair after the movie's release, and this led to Cheng giving Yu a key to his house. This is the house that he's still sharing with his wife. Obviously, his wife is still out, she's still working away quite a lot, and so there was one condition. Yu could have this key and she could come and go as she pleased, on the condition that his wife wasn't there. She could never find out that they were having this affair. Yu agreed, and the affair continued, although it would halt for a little while in early 1994 because Yu's dad passed away and she went to visit him and bury him. By April of that year, the pair reconnected, and one evening Yu rang Cheng and asked if she could see him that night. He agreed. They went out for a very expensive dinner, they had drinks, they went to a karaoke bar, and then they ended up back at Cheng's place. The couple slept together, they had sex, and then the next morning, Yu told him that she was pregnant and the child was likely his. And now initially, Cheng acted surprised and happy. He acted like this could be a good thing, but what was going on inside his mind was completely the opposite to that. We don't know exactly what happened over the next couple of hours of the morning, but we do know that at some point Yu was at the dressing table putting on her makeup when Cheng snuck up behind her and shot her in the back of her head. Now this didn't actually kill her straight away, but she fell onto the floor and she was bleeding a lot, and the two of them shared a look. Cheng would later say that he saw her dying in front of his eyes and he just let it happen. She did eventually die, and Cheng then took her body outside and buried her in the garden. And this time he buried her body as a whole body. He didn't cut it up, much like he did with his other victims, Zhang, Liu, Yang and Hu. During all of this time, Cheng's dog's appearance in An Old Man and His Dog had become quite the talking point, and in time word got out, and it wasn't long before he was inundated with offers to buy the dogs he'd been breeding for the last few years. Word got about and a man called Ma Wei became interested. Ma Wei had attended the same school as Cheng many years ago, and he was looking for some help. He'd bought 10 Tibetan Mastiffs, very expensive dogs, who he'd got and then not really understood how to train them. He wanted the now well-known Cheng's help in training them. Cheng did initially agree, but at some point shortly after that first conversation they had, he learnt how much those 10 dogs would be worth, and it was a lot of money. That night he spoke to Xiao, his accomplice, and the two of them came up with a plan. They decided that they were going to kill Ma Wei, and then they were going to steal his 10 dogs and sell them and come up with a nice profit. But the next day, when Ma Wei returned to the house, he happened to mention that he was a police officer, and this really worried the two men, and they decided to go back on their plan. They said it wasn't worth it and they would wait for the next robbery opportunity. They ended up just letting him go, and they didn't help him with the training really, but they were psyched up for this murder. They got themselves ready to make a lot of money, and so they started looking for their next victim. That came pretty quickly when Cheng was contacted by another old school friend called Zhang Ming. The man, Zhang Ming, told Cheng that he had a business opportunity for him. He was going to offer to pay 1.5 million yuan for some cashmere wool. Cheng said yes to this, but he had no way of getting that amount of cashmere wool. Of course, he never intended to, but Zhang Ming thought that he did. They thought they had this business agreement, and so he left with the agreement that he would give Cheng some time to get that cashmere wool together, just as Zhang Ming would get the money together, and then they'd meet up again and do the transaction. Days passed, and as Cheng was waiting for the phone call to say that Zhang Ming had got that money together, he ran into another friend of his, Li Sanwei. Cheng and Li reconnected pretty quickly, and that ended up with Cheng telling Li about this business opportunity and the fact that Zhang Ming was about to pay him 1.5 million yuan just to have this cashmere wool, and obviously Cheng didn't have that, and so he told Li his plan was to just steal that money from him. It was in early 1995 that Cheng invited both Li Sanwei and Zhang Ming to his house. He invited them over for dinner and for a cup of tea. When they arrived, Cheng gave Li a cup of tea, and he gave Zhang a cup of tea, and in Zhang's cup of tea there was sleeping pills that had been crushed and put into it, and this meant that once he drank it, he fell into a really deep sleep quite quickly. And that's when Cheng got out his gun, handed it to Li, and told him that he needed to shoot Zhang Ming right now and kill him. But Li refused. He said he couldn't do it, and he gave the gun back to Cheng. But of course, Cheng didn't have a problem with this. He just took the gun back and shot Zhang Ming in the head. And then he turned to Li and he said that they needed to go to Zhang Ming's house and get the 1.5 million yuan. But when the pair arrived at Zhang Ming's house, they looked around and they could only find a couple of hundred yuan. So they knew that the money must be elsewhere, but they were on a time limit. They couldn't keep searching because they knew that his wife would be back any minute. They couldn't risk her coming home and having to kill her too, because it might draw too much attention to themselves. And so they left. The very next day, Cheng went to a payphone and he called Zhang Ming's home phone, and his wife answered. He said that he was a business partner, and he said he wanted to keep his name anonymous, but he was a business partner of Zhang Ming, and he needed to know where the money was at, because as part of a business venture that they were about to embark on, he was going to be in charge of the money part of it. This obviously sounded incredibly fishy to Zhang Ming's wife, and so his wife said, "I don't believe you. I don't know what money you're talking about. I've never been told about this money." She hung up, But then she started to get a little niggle in her mind that something bad might have happened. She hadn't seen Zhang Ming since last night, she didn't know where he was right now, and she was concerned that something bad might have happened to him. And so she reported her husband as missing to police. Authorities were immediately suspicious and they brought Cheng in to question him. And whilst he was there, he wasn't really giving anything away, and they realised that although he was the last person to have seen Zhang Ming alive, they couldn't actually hold him. But what they did want to do was take him back to his house and do a search of the house. So they took him back, they escorted him back to his house. But because he wasn't under arrest, they let him just go off and roam the house freely. And that's when he decided to escape. He didn't want to answer any more of their questions. He didn't want to be in this situation. And so as soon as he went through the house, he headed straight outside, jumped on top of one of the dog's kennels and over the fence at the back of the garden. And then he ran away, and he did escape for a good few days. Now, whilst Cheng was off running, trying to find somewhere to stay, the officers were at his house and they brought in a forensics team to do a search of the house. And inside, they found a number of guns. They didn't know at this point they were the guns that would be linked to the murders that Cheng had committed. They also found bloodstains inside the house, and outside in the garden, when they started digging, they found a number of human remains. Even though the authorities weren't able to find Cheng immediately, they did track down Xiao, and Xiao confessed pretty much straight away, and he also implicated Dewey in the murders, or some of the murders, and so he was brought in for questioning too. Eventually, Cheng made his way to the Weiyang district where his nephew worked. His nephew wasn't around, but he started talking to another employee who invited him in for a cup of tea. During their conversation, the employee realised that the man sat in front of him was the same man who was on every wanted poster pasted around all of the local towns. He managed to alert the police and they ambushed him. They arrived to the location dressed in civilian clothes because they were worried that they could be met with aggression and violence, but they managed to surprise Cheng and they arrested him on the spot. Dewey was given a suspended death sentence, which meant that if he didn't commit any crimes for the next 2 years, his sentence would be turned into a life sentence instead. Cheng and Xiao were given the death penalty, and Cheng never showed any remorse for his crimes. In fact, he said that for all of the women that he killed, he had no remorse for them. They deserved to die because they were interfering in his family matters, and so he didn't care that they were dead. Both men were killed straight after their sentencing, and Cheng's dogs, all 20 that were left, were put down as well. Cheng Peng killed 6 people, and the result of his actions meant that all of his dogs were killed too. And even now, over 30 years after those horrific murders, the people of Yinchuan remember Cheng Peng to be one of the most notorious and horrific serial killers that ever lived. Thank you for watching this episode of Red Rum. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. If you aren't subscribed, please subscribe. And also, we have a couple of options if you'd like to support Red Rum, the channel. We have a podcast, we have a Patreon for that podcast where you can get access to early releases, things like that. And we also have membership on YouTube now where you can also access early releases and some other perks and things on there. So check those out if you're able to support. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.